What it is, people, my name is Batman, and compared to other games on the market for $60 right now, Destiny is pretty good. But compared to what was advertised for the last 2 years, compared to what we were all expecting when we pre-ordered this game, Destiny is a monumental failure. Destiny is the epitome of false advertising. I don't think any game will ever see the kind of pre-order numbers that this industry has been jerking off to for the last few years. 2014 was the year they cried wolf one too many times. 2014 is the year that the gaming community's many pre-orders were rewarded in the end with nothing but regret. A straw could have broken the camel's back following the colossal disappointments of Ghost, Battlefield 4, Titanfall, and Watch Dogs, but Destiny was more than a straw. Destiny was the 200 tons of wet cement that broke the camel and drowned it for good. With this video, I want to explore the various ways in which the greed and incompetence of a major corporation ruined Destiny and destroyed the masterpiece that could have been. Some of this will inevitably be speculation, but much of it is fact, and I will cite every source thoroughly in the description below. What we know to be true, as a matter of absolute fact, is that there is a significant amount of fully developed content already on your game disc ready to be played right now that has been purposely locked off, made unavailable to you at launch. For instance, this is the Seraphim Vault. You probably heard a lot about this during Destiny's alpha. Some players were able to glitch into this area. Now, it didn't cause a lot of controversy at the time because we all assumed it would be available in the final game, but of course it wasn't. Now, as you can see inside, there is clearly a build ready to go. Its development was presumably complete or near completion because Bungie felt comfortable enough with it to implement it into the finalized game files, and this was all the way back in the alpha, which of course would have left them a considerable amount of time to finish it entirely, assuming it wasn't already finished at the time. Now, this is some content you may have heard about more recently. This is an area in the Black Garden that players have been able to glitch into as well. It is presumably the Hypogeum Strike. The community was able to make this deduction off of this world map on your screen right now, which was found in the game files on your disc as well, and details a wide range of content we haven't seen as of the launch of Destiny, including map locations for the Hypogeum Strike and the Seraphim Vault. We know that both of those areas are clearly fully built and were ready to be inserted into the final game files burned onto the discs. They just need to be populated with enemies. With that in mind, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to presume that a lot of the other content detailed in this world map found in the game, but not currently playable in the actual game, is also already fully developed and burned onto your game disc, because in fact there are other areas that we know exist that are clearly not in the game. If you take a look at this clip, this is from an official Destiny gameplay trailer. It's brief, but clearly this wooded area is not in the game. I would assume it's on Earth, and my best guess is that it's old Chicago. Any of you who were following this game before it was released will probably have heard references to old Chicago. We know it was in the conception phase, at least, as another playable area on Earth, but regardless, whatever this wooded area is, it's a playable build. It was a playable build over a year ago when this trailer released, and at the time, the developers were obviously under the impression that it would be a part of the game because they put it in their own goddamn gameplay trailer. Likewise, in the same official Destiny trailer released over a year ago, we see clear references to Mercury and Jupiter as playable areas available as destinations from the intergalactic map. Does that mean those planets were fully developed? No. But it does mean Bungie was under the impression that they would be fully developed or they wouldn't stick them in an official trailer. And of course, we hear frequent references to Mercury throughout the campaign, such as when our Dinklebot tells us that it is a world transformed into one big machine by the Vex. And isn't it also kind of suspicious that Mercury is the only planet with a map in multiplayer, but that makes no appearance in the PvE? So here's the cold hard truth. If the Hypogeum Strike or the Seraphim Vault or that playable woodland area from the trailer are in Destiny's expansion packs, then the only logical conclusion to draw is that for one reason or another, content was cut from the original game so that they could sell it to you for an extra $15. In fact, it wasn't even cut, just locked away, because clearly much of it is already on your disc. There are a few separate scenarios that might explain how this came to be, because it doesn't seem like this was their plan from the beginning, because if it was, they wouldn't have showed that shit off in trailers over a year ago, because that would raise a lot of uncomfortable questions, which is of course what has happened, and the content wouldn't already be on the discs. Now, the first and most shameful scenario would be pure greed, that they saw an opportunity to make more money by cutting content out of the original game to sell it as DLC DLC instead of spending the money to have an entirely original expansion pack built from scratch. All the profit of an expansion pack without any of the cost. Or, if in the unlikely event that they did plan for this content to be shipped as DLC from the beginning, from the content's very conception, I still consider that greedy and shameful, because the time developers spent working on this DLC should have been spent working on the main game. Cutting out significant amounts of developers' time from working on the base game pre-release so that they can build DLC is in my eyes no different and no less shameful than cutting out the content itself to be reshipped as DLC. The second scenario would be a combination of greed and incompetence. It seems pretty clear at this point that this game went through some huge revisions and was dramatically changed basically at the last minute, less than a year out from release. Specifically, we have strong indications that the story was basically rewritten entirely. Here's a scene from an official trailer where the Queen of the Reef's brother attacks you on Earth.
Why don't you put that down so we can talk?
Out here in the wild, this is how we talk.
This scene alone, I would argue, implies at least one huge chunk of the narrative was cut. It might be that they simply didn't know how to fit the Seraphim Vault or the Hypogeum Strike or whatever other content is already on the disc into their new plotline. So what would be inappropriate, I think, is if they found a way to fit this content into the DLC and then sold it to us, because they would essentially be making a very healthy profit off of their own incompetence. Which is legal, but a huge slap in the face to the consumers and the loyal fan base that Bungie cultivated over the last 2 years of hyping this game. The third scenario would be full incompetence. They couldn't fit the content into their new plot, and that content isn't coming in DLC either. It's gone for good. The only possible positive outcome of these major inconsistencies would be if Bungie unlocked this playable content to us as part of an event or what have you, free of charge and available to everyone who bought the base game originally. But judging by the unoriginal, monotonous, and pointless in-game events we have seen so far, I would bet a full set of fully upgraded raid gear that this possibility is nothing but fantasy. Now, there's also reason to believe that there were significant amounts of content that cannot be possibly reshipped as DLC simply because they are seemingly game-wide mechanisms that would change the very nature of the game itself. The last and biggest discrepancy I want to point out, the clearest example of false advertising on the part of Bungie, comes from a developer commentary. This is from the developers themselves. This is the E3 Destiny gameplay trailer. The next day, 3 of the developers did a sort of developer diary commentary over the gameplay to explain it a little bit and talk about what's going on. It's just a marketing thing geared for the hardcore fans who are just lapping up every piece of information at the time that includes myself. But listen to what one of these developers has to say about Destiny.
I think Player 2 looks pretty nice.
Player 2 does look
She's
pretty
got
nice.
some
Player 2,
sweet clothes, an awesome cape,
she's a hunter.
all customized gear that's either acquired on many adventures or purchased or traded or gambled for.
So we're going to talk about gambling in just a second here, but first I want to draw your attention to the fact that he says you could have either purchased or traded for your items. I would argue this implies that there was at one point a player trading system in Destiny. These words are technically synonyms. Purchase and trade essentially mean the same thing, an exchange of stuff. But it seems like in this developer's mind they mean two different things. Typically, in most MMOs, the term trade is used to refer to a transaction with another player. It's very rare that in an MMO you hear players use the term trade to reference a transaction with an NPC bot. If you ask someone how they got that piece of gear and they reply, "I traded for it," I think most people would assume a trade between two human players. And I know Destiny isn't technically an MMO, but a lot of the same lingo carries over, right? PvE, PvP, DPS, aggro, loot, farming, etc., etc. I think when this developer says that you can purchase or trade for items, he's referring to two different kinds of transactions taking place with an NPC as separate from transactions taking place with an actual character. And this would really explain the entire Destiny loot system. Every drop in this game is random, right? Every reward, excluding strange coins from the weekly, is random. And until recently, to get the good items, you had to not only roll once to get the legendary engram, but twice when you took it to the Cryptarch for decryption. This loot system makes absolutely no sense in a game where supposedly trading was not put in because they wanted to make sure everyone unlocked the items themselves. Because people aren't unlocking or necessarily quote-unquote earning their items based on individual accomplishment. They are rolling for them. However, if there was originally an in-game economy in player trading, then the random loot system makes perfect sense. Because if, say, you were guaranteed a legendary shotgun every time you beat this one strike on the hardest difficulty, 50, then that shotgun wouldn't be rare anymore because eventually enough players would have obtained it, maybe several times over, that there would be an infinite amount of it on the market. It would be very cheap to buy it off people because there would be such a fat amount of supply of that item, and there would be that much less incentive to beat the boss to get it the legit way. If a rare item was hypothetically guaranteed for beating a boss, millions of players would beat that boss, and then there would be millions of that rare item on the market, and it would no longer be rare. That's how in-game economies work, right? But if the entire system is random, it controls how much stuff is getting put on the market. They wanted to make sure that legendary items remained very difficult to get and very expensive in the in-game economy. So they made a system where you have to roll twice. Again, once when you get the legendary engram, once when you decrypt it. The system of random would control market supply. If there's a 0.1 chance that you roll for the exotic shotgun in MP, then that shotgun stays rare no matter what, and thus, if someone wants to sell it, they can sell it for a hefty price. This would ensure that rare items stayed expensive on the market and thus didn't stop being rare. Most MMOs have a very similar random loot system where you have to roll even after killing some big bad boss for precisely this same reason, so that the in-game economy doesn't wreck item value. Or, more simply put, Destiny's loot system seems to be designed around player trading. Now granted, that is pretty speculative, but obviously what we don't have to speculate about is gambling. A year ago, this developer was confident that gambling was a part of Destiny, and unfortunately we don't know the specifics, but we do know that in his mind, you could win pieces of armor, loot, actual gear from this gambling, because he's talking about the different ways in which this hunter could have obtained her gear. So there are two possibilities. The first is that in the original conception of Destiny, you gambled against an NPC bot, and the bot randomly bets pieces of armor and loot equivalent to the amount of gear you bet. That system sounds stupid, easily abused, and unlikely. The bot would have an incredibly hard time determining how much you value the items you're betting. And why would anyone risk the good items they have against random loot they might not even want? And again, this is speculative, but I think it is much more likely that you gambled against a human player. And if you could gamble against human players, then you had to have been able to trade with them, because if the reason they don't have trading is because they want you to unlock everything on your own, then they couldn't have had PvP gambling, because players would just use it as a de facto trading system, a loophole, if you will, and a very obvious loophole that the developers would have absolutely been aware of as a possibility, that a high-level player with a bunch of exotic and legendaries he doesn't use anymore could bet those against his friend who just got the game and intentionally lose the bet and then bam, accomplish the very thing that Bungie was trying to prevent by not having trading. So if they didn't have player trading, they wouldn't have player gambling. If they did have player gambling, they had to have had player trading. Those two are tied at the hip in my eyes, and I strongly believe there was at one point an in-game economy and player trading in Destiny. Now, what could players have potentially been betting on? This is very speculative, but I have a hunch there was once Sparrow racing. The Sparrows were clearly designed with something more in mind than just fast travel at one point. They have stats similar to those you'd find in a racing game: better braking, better maneuverability, better acceleration, higher speed, stronger durability. There are legendary Sparrows and exotic Sparrows. Some Sparrows can do the LB RB boost left and right thing. You can buy exotic Sparrow upgrades from Xur for strange coins, but why? Why do players need a faster, stronger, more agile Sparrow? So that they can get to the beginning of a strike 2 seconds faster than the rest of their fire team? They're just going to have to wait for them to catch up eventually anyways. So they can take advantage of high quality braking to take sharper turns that much quicker, so that they can farm spirit blooms faster, so that their Sparrow can take more of a beating without breaking down, because if it broke they might be put in the unfortunate situation of having to push 2 buttons on their controller and immediately summon a new one. Upgraded higher quality Sparrows serve absolutely no purpose and have no practical advantage over the default Sparrow, and yet we have an entire wing of the tower dedicated to Sparrows and of course the spaceships, which are the most pointless features of all, and it begs the question, why? It seems like there is an enormous amount of evidence of a much grander masterpiece that was advertised to us, laced through the final shitty build that was sold to us. When I first saw this developer commentary where he mentioned gambling and trading, I was left with the impression that gambling and trading were in this game, as was the case I think with many fans who saw this video when it was originally posted a year ago. That is false advertising, not on a grand scale, only in subtle ways, which is of course how it always is these days. But of course, the most painful and generally agreed upon disappointment in Destiny was the story, and what exacerbated the pain of this failure was how unexpected and mysterious it was that the story was so bad, so confusing and uninspired, inspiring, when the story was one of the main selling points, when we were all so obsessed with reading about the backstory and symbology in Destiny even before it was released, when we had all had such powerful connections and emotional responses to Bungie's previous story work in Halo. We know for a fact that huge parts of the story, perhaps most of it, was cut or rearranged in the final year before the game's launch. Now, eyebrows were initially raised when in September 2013, a year before the game's release, the game's lead creative writer, Joseph Staten, left Bungie. He was also the lead writer for Halo. To this day, nobody really knows why. In a statement following his departure, Staten said he left because he was interested in taking on new creative challenges. It's fairly vague, and I don't know what could be more creatively challenging than building an entire interactive gaming universe. So it begs the question, why would this writer, who had spent the last 4 years of his life writing the Destiny story, building the backstory for the entire Destiny universe, its characters and lore and the factions, not necessarily all by himself, but he was the project lead, right? Why would he leave after all that time and effort? Why would he leave what is undoubtedly the highest paying writing gig in the industry? There's always more money to be made for everyone involved, but especially project leads when the game launches. Why not wait out the last year just to see all your hard work, 4 years of it, come to fruition at least? Maybe because in that final year he was notified that the decision had been made to put all of his hard work on the chopping block, that the story and the universe he had worked so hard to craft were going to be gutted. Because regardless of what we know about the mysterious and sudden departure of Destiny's lead creative writer, we do know that Destiny's story was once very different from the shitty husk of a narrative that it is now. So by now many of you have probably heard or seen this interesting post that is from an anonymous player who apparently tested the game back in 2013 and experienced a very different game and storyline. As a general summary, when this guy played the game, he was abducted by a character named Crow, possibly played by the Queen of the Reef's brother, who took him to a band of ex-Guardians, and they go around the galaxy visiting various AIs to uncover the truth that the Speaker and the Traveler are in fact the Darkness, and that the Hive is using the Hellmouth on the moon as a place to build a big old device that will revive the Traveler and let it shit on the world once again. Now, was this guy trolling or was he legit? It's hard to say, but I lean towards legitimacy for two reasons. One, Bungie did not flat out deny this rumor after it took off on the internet. David Daig, the community manager, also known as Deej, I believe that's his username, or at least whoever Deej is, he says he's the community manager too. But regardless, he released a statement that said, and I quote, "I'd rather spend the precious time we have together coming up with ideas for how the game can better support us as a community. I'd rather we look toward the next update. There may come a time when we take a probing look back at the challenges we faced during the development of Destiny, but those won't be my stories to tell." End quote. So, an important life lesson you should always remember is that when a business or politician refuses to flat out deny something and instead gives some sort of vague non-answer like that clarifies nothing, it's because there's some truth to that something which they refuse to deny outright. And on top of that, Reddit removed this anonymous poster's thread. It's kind of like that line from Shakespeare, "Methinks thou doth protest too much." Now, the reason these two bits of evidence are compelling is because you can compare that to another instance of an anonymous poster talking some shit. This time, an anonymous poster on Reddit claimed he was a Bungie employee and he had a long Q&A with Reddit users supposedly detailing what went on behind the scenes in the last year at Bungie. In this anonymous post, the same community manager, David Daig, or Deej, flat out denied it this time, posting, and I quote, "You are being trolled, internet, don't let it happen." So that's a much more assertive denial than the previous paragraph vague answer he gave for the other anonymous post. In this one, he's claiming the guy is a troll. He's accusing him of lying. Furthermore, this guy's post was not taken down, not even off of Bungie's own forums on their website. So these two anonymous sources got very different treatments. The anonymous Bungie employee received a flat-out denial and was not suppressed, but the anonymous game tester did not receive a flat-out denial, and someone was upset enough by its post to have it removed from Reddit. The only reason it's still around is because a bunch of people took screenshots. Furthermore, the original anonymous post by the beta tester was apparently legitimate enough that many reputable news outlets, including IGN and even Forbes, wrote articles about it, whereas the latter post by the anonymous Bungie employee did not receive that kind of attention. I think those news outlets wrote those stories because journalists know better than anyone else a refusal to flat out deny something is in fact a de facto admission. Now, what I also think lends the beta tester's claim some legitimacy is this concept art that I feel proves that at one point the Traveler was clearly intended to be evil. This is the original concept art for the Black Garden. Notice how it seems to be built on a curved structure, as if it's on the inside of a giant sphere, like the Traveler. Notice how if you take away the grass in the actual playable Black Garden build, the architecture and coloring scheme are identical to that of the Traveler? Wouldn't it make more sense that that giant black heart you destroy is in fact at the center of some being instead of just a random heart in a portal on Venus? We know that at some point the Queen of the Reef's brother attacked your main character on Earth, and they felt comfortable enough showing that scene in an official trailer. Was the Queen of the Reef's brother originally Crow? Is this the scene that the poster is talking about? Probably, because here's another screenshot featured in a trailer of a quest to gain favor with the Queen by helping Crow. So Crow and the Queen were buds. We know that much to be true at least, and we know Crow kidnaps you on Earth, and we have this image of the Queen's brother who seems to be kidnapping you on Earth. We also know at some point before it was just a training simulation, which is the most boring and lazy explanation ever, the Crucible was actually called Faction Wars, which makes sense as all the factions reward Crucible marks, and further, the descriptions of the game modes are such things as Dead Orbit seeks new territories to expand its reach. But why would Dead Orbit be seeking new territories in training simulations? And in fact, there were two factions that we have seen lots of concept art for, such as the Seven Seraphs, who apparently even have their own in-game area, the Seraphim Vault, but were apparently cut altogether, which would of course explain why that Seraphim Vault isn't accessible in the first place. So once we establish that significant amounts of in-game content were cut, the next obvious question is why? Why did Bungie deliberately water this game down and make it shittier? People's biggest complaints about this game are always that it does not have enough content, and because of that becomes repetitive, and that the story sucks, and now it looks like these shortcomings are intentional. But how could that be? There are several theories to consider here. It may have been just one of these, it may have had to do a little with each of these, but these are the most likely possibilities based on my intensive study of this particular subject. The first and most likely cause of Destiny's shortcoming might be that in the last year they decided they had to dumb the game way down to appeal to a more casual market. You know, when they first started working on this game 5 years ago, this whole marketing strategy of dumbing a game way down to jack up sales was still largely undiscovered. It was the COD series, and MW2 especially, that really brought that marketing tactic to the forefront and showed how effective it could be consistently. It might be that they built this huge complex game and then figured out that if they wanted it to be as big as COD, they had to nerf the shit out of its intellectual requirements. This might explain why player trading and gambling are gone. I've talked about before how random always disproportionately benefits weaker players. The loot system in its current state is 100% random, and it keeps everyone on an even playing field. The weaker player, the newer player, hell, even the AFK player are just as likely to roll for an exotic or legendary as the strong player is. An in-game economy would change this, for the same reasons I was talking about earlier. Suddenly everyone would have a way to work towards specific monetary goals, and this would disproportionately benefit stronger players who would find more effective ways to work towards said monetary goals, because the cool thing about in-game economies is that they allow for a lot of creativity, a lot of critical thought and problem solving, and they can be confusing at times. The players who were taking the time to check online forums for potential buyers and sellers, buying up low amounts of material at a low price and then selling in bulk for a wide profit margin, players with the patience and know-how to farm and grind for massive amounts of a certain material might be able to acquire full legendary and the ascendants to upgrade it all in a very short period of time. Stronger players would be using whatever other unique business tactics they picked up or figured out that always develop in any in-game economy. It takes skill to keep track of prices that are always fluctuating. Stronger, devious players might have it in them to rip off other players for exorbitantly high prices or what have you. An 18-year-old would be able to outplay a 10-year-old in an in-game economy every single time, but this game is rated T. They still want it to be accessible to 10-year-olds. An in-game economy would serve as a catalyst for stronger players to rapidly outpace weaker players in terms of gear acquisition. That's part of the reason they put caps on the amount of Vanguard or Crucible marks you can get per week. How many times you run the raid a week, because if you just spam that shit indefinitely, you'd have a big chunk of the player base fully leveled up and pimped the fuck out, while it took the majority of the player base weeks to reach that point. And the result would be that the majority of the player base wouldn't feel like badass motherfuckers. They'd feel like a lower tier of player, but they don't want that. They can't have that, because making people feel like badasses is the best way to sell games. That's what COD taught the industry. You have to make people feel like they are the best, like they are in the top tier of players. That means lowering the skill gap and trying to force a level playing field that is accessible to all equally. That's why Iron Banner was a lie. That's why they put those caps on Vanguard and Crucible marks, so you don't get too far ahead of your fellow players in terms of high level gear too fast. Dumbing the game down for low-tier players might also explain the lackluster open world. Outside of resource farming, which is painfully boring and monotonous to begin with, those 6 patrol missions on each planet are at this point the only real activity to pursue in the open world. They're boring and repetitive, but they're also incredibly simple and can be done casually. To spice things up, you would have to add complexity. And when I speak of low-tier players, I'm not necessarily talking about stupid people. More often it's just very young people, 8 to 12-year-olds who aren't usually the best players just because their minds are still developing. Like, we weren't very good players when we were 8 to 12 years old. And what many of us perceive as simplistic tasks may in fact be complex in their own right to a younger audience. And guess what? This game is rated T. There are very few big AAA titles these days that make a point of avoiding explicit content that might earn them an M rating. But Destiny did intentionally avoid this kind of M-rated content, and what does that tell us? That they are perhaps pursuing a younger audience than is typical of shooter games these days. COD, Battlefield, GTA, obviously, even Titanfall got an M rating, and it's not even that violent. It's like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, for God's sakes. I mean, you have to really put in effort and eventually probably cut some stuff out to achieve that T rating. And if they were that aggressive about pursuing a T rating, it really does imply that they wanted to be made available to a younger audience. And a younger audience needs a simpler game because the younger you are, the harder it is to grasp complex concepts like an in-game economy or a well-crafted open world. Appealing to a younger, less intellectually evolved audience would also explain the monotonous simplicity of the story missions. Move from point A to point B, defend Dinklebot again and again and again. Boring for us because it's repetitive and simple, exciting for little kids because they can do it. And lastly, the appeal to a more casual, younger, and dumb audience might actually explain why the story got cut. Now, Halo's story was also complex, but it had an M rating. Destiny's story, I believe, was at one point much more complex and intricately designed than Halo's. I remember before this game launched spending literally hours reading about backstory and symbolism, the symbology of the wolf, the allegory of the darkness and the light, the metaphor of the Golden Age and comparisons to Rome and the Traveler as a messiah or prophet. There was so much philosophy and history embedded just in the backstory details before the game even came out. There's plenty of evidence suggesting that at one point each faction really did have its own storyline, exploring its unique philosophy about complex subjects like the inevitability of conflict or the desire for a single philosopher king, which is Socratic. I can just imagine them focus group testing this shit on 10-year-olds, and the 10-year-olds are like, what the fuck are you even talking about? Was Destiny designed and in the end ultimately gutted in order to be more readily accessible by little children so that little children could congregate on Destiny instead of getting pwned all the time in COD and going .60 KD against the older COD audience, much of which consists of full-fledged, even college-educated adults at this point despite popular belief? Or was the story removed from the game entirely because when Staten left he had already put enough work into the story to be entitled to commission upon the game's release, a commission that Bungie decided they didn't want to pay? Or was the story removed because they wanted to drag it out and make it last longer through DLC on future games so that you would be compelled to give them even more money? And yet, another entirely separate possible cause of this game's last-minute nerfing is the console transition. Thing you need to understand about this console transition is that none of these developers or publishers, not even the big ones, were entirely sure how to handle it or what would happen or how fast people would transition. And they were open about that fact. The problem is the last time something like this happened was 10 years ago, and all the data from that period of transition isn't very applicable to today's scenario because the market and the industry are so different now than they were 10 years ago when people were upgrading from original Xbox and PS2 to the 360 and PS3. The gaming industry has blown up exponentially since then. Gaming wasn't even that mainstream back then, but now after Halo and Call of Duty and the influx of app peasants who were inspired by their skills on Doodle Jump, everyone plays fucking games, and the gaming industry is bringing in more dough than Hollywood, and people are using their consoles for more than just games today. They're a top media viewing device now as well. And another thing to keep in mind is that the last console transition was before the Great Recession. Consumer spending abilities are not what they once were, not by a long shot, because 95% of the income gains recovered from the Great Recession have gone to the top 1% of people. I think that in the last year before release, Activision figured something out, something dark about the console transition that many other publishers have recently been putting together as well. For starters, not enough people are upgrading quick enough. And of course this game was always supposed to be available to the old gen as well, but I think the original plan was to still have features on the new gen that would take advantage of the new gen's capabilities. Features that wouldn't be available on the old gen because the old gen didn't have said capabilities. Have you noticed how in almost every game that's released on both the old gen and the new gen port never has any advanced capabilities that the old gen doesn't have? I think at one point Destiny did have next gen features, but at the last minute those features had to be taken out because the data started coming in and they got wise to this dark trend that is shitting on a lot of games right now. When you release a game on more than one console, but one of those consoles has a significantly superior set of capabilities, and subsequently the game has a lot more cool stuff in it on that console than it does on the other lesser console, people are going to be considerably less likely to buy it on the older lesser console that cannot do the same cool stuff. And I kind of understand why. If there was an epic as fuck game coming out on the PC, but they were bringing a scaled down version to Xbox, I probably wouldn't be that excited about it, you know, because it feels like you're not getting the same experience for the same amount of money. It feels like you're getting shortchanged. It feels like the game developer values you less than its other customers. I don't have any hard data on that, but it's obvious when you look at the decisions publishers have been making this year. Remember when Watch Dogs graphics were intentionally downgraded on the PC? You may have heard recently that Assassin's Creed Unity is going to run at 900p on both the Xbox One and the PS4, even though the PS4 could have gotten much better graphics, and they were open about that fact. They talked about it in an interview, and the guy literally said they didn't want us fighting over it all the time, but that's bullshit. They just didn't want sales on the Xbox One to tank. That would explain why Destiny didn't come to the PC, because the graphics would have been ridiculous on the PC. They would have been able to ramp up the frame rate as well. The only piece of tangible evidence I have to support this fact is the enemy's dropships in-game. You'll notice the only piece of these dropships that's destructible are the turrets, and yet, if you shoot the main hull of the ship, you'll still get hit markers, and in fact, if you have some sort of lingering damage effect, for instance on Thorn, I have the upgrade for deep impact bullets, which damage the target for a couple seconds after it's been shot. You can see the lingering damage effect the entire dropship, not just the turrets, right? So when you shoot something with Thorn, the enemy lights up with a strange green neon coloring, looks like the target is poisoned or something, and when you shoot the dropship, the entire dropship acts as if it's taking lingering damage. I can't help but think the only explanation for why the entire dropship would register hit markers and lingering damage is that at one point it was supposed to be a destroyable enemy. Now, of course, we all remember in every Halo after Halo 2, enemy dropships were destroyable. In fact, that was one of my favorite things to do, blow those fucking things out of the sky with a tank before they dropped off their peeps, and then in Reach you get a fat amount of medals for it. However, I also remember that oftentimes blowing those dropships up had a somewhat adverse effect on frame rate, especially when there was a bunch of other shit going on at the same time. We know that Destiny has incredible graphics, but we also know it's capped at 30 frames per second, which tells us obviously it's maxed out in terms of what it can fit on your screen. Is it possible that at one point in time the original intention was to have dropships blow up, but then they realized they couldn't maintain a satisfactory frame rate during said explosion? I mean, think of all the situations in which dropships make an appearance and would be potentially destructible. In the middle of huge firefights against bosses like Fogarth, in the middle of open world public events, they show up often in these fights that are probably already pushing the game to its technical limits. If you blew up a dropship while fighting 3 wizards in Fogarth with the intense level of detail and lighting effects and the graphics to begin with, would the frame rate be able to handle it? Probably not on the old gen, which means it had to get scrapped on the new gen too. And this is just one instance of hard evidence I could find. It might be there's an entire list of things which were not technically feasible, either on one console or both, but it doesn't matter because for the sake of sales they have to be on a level playing field anyways. That might explain why there's so few vehicles in multiplayer. Also, notice in this clip from the official gameplay trailer that players are getting dropped off by their ships right at their fire team's location in the open world. That's a pretty cool feature. Why'd that get taken out? Now look, I don't have the answers to any of these questions, but these questions are legitimate and shared widely among the community. And until we have had answers, we should assume the worst because that's what silence implies. Whatever took place here, there's only one thing that I'm absolutely certain of, that the mediocrity of Destiny is the result of greed and incompetence, of people at the top trying to manipulate it in such a way that they could get more for less. And this is a very common trend we have seen consistently in the last 2 years of video game releases. Developers are no longer building games that intrigue us because they match the complexity of our human intellect. Instead, through a combination of greed and sloth, developers and publishers are learning to prey on our worst traits, to appeal to our obsessive need for self-validation and stroking our own ego, to make money off of convincing us we are special because we are good at a game that we don't realize everyone else is just as good at too. They know we won't recognize that when everyone's special, nobody is. And they know that we're gullible and that hype is contagious. If they spend enough money telling us a game is good, we will believe it. They have learned to exploit the purest form of human intellect, our hope that this next game will be the one we've been waiting for, that it will match the enjoyment we felt on Halo 2 or Knights of the Old Republic, and alas, it never does, and in fact, the best games these days receive so very little attention. Borderlands, the pre-sequel, is probably the weakest entry in the Borderlands franchise, and it is still head and shoulders and cock above this game. People often accuse me of taking video games too seriously, but I would say that they don't take it seriously enough. Gaming, the evolution of this industry, the collective education of we gamers, the master race, is more important to me than anything other than politics itself. Games are the pinnacle of human creativity, the limitless finale of art, drawing from sound, sight, critical thought, and the immersion of the mind. Gaming itself is threatened by this dastardly trend towards appealing to the lowest common denominator, perpetrated by Activision wholly, yet adopted gradually by everyone else. It is an infection that is spreading rapidly and destroying everything it touches, with Destiny its latest casualty. And it is not the first time clever greed and sloth has corrupted a form of media. Cable news is a prime example of what can happen when an industry decides to make money by exploiting our worst traits. Reality television in general, which of course is all cable news is these days, is the monument to our collective sin. We must not let our beloved hobby degenerate the same way television degenerated into cupcake wars and honey boo boo. We must take a stand here and now, so that for generations to come, our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren will recognize that we, the original gaming generation, took a stand here and now, that we drew a line in the sand and said this far and no further, that we rejected incompetence, that we rejected greed, that we rejected mediocrity. We have to hit them in the only place they care about or that they will even notice, and recognize our frustrations, their wallets. Do it now and do it hard. Don't buy this coming Destiny DLC that was supposed to be on the disc. Don't fool yourself into thinking it will magically cease to be a repetitive grind. That's the kind of gullibility they prey on that exacerbates the problem. Now, some of us, myself included, are already victims of our own gullibility. We pre-ordered the non-refundable deluxe digital edition and have already been sold this DLC, which we realize we no longer care for. Avenge us, comrades. The revolution begins in the digistructural streets. If we are to secure a high-quality future, we must reject a low-quality present. If you support the cause, please rate, favorite, comment, and share. Make your frustrations known in the comments. Let the hate and the vitriol you feel spill out here and now. What don't you like in Destiny, and why don't you like it? And what do you think is the most likely cause of your dissatisfaction? And may the Force be with us all in these dark times. This is Batman signing out.